Hello and welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, as always, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this week?
Positively splendid, Gary. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. This week we're talking about supplements once again, continuing the supplement series, and this week we're going to be talking about supplements that relate to fat loss. And this is obviously a popular area of supplementation. I think maybe slightly less so among the mainstream fitness industry in recent years. I think there's been a little bit of cop on in terms of some of the supplements being pushed to the side. However, peripherally, you will still see quite a lot of supplements that are recommended for fat loss, many of which do very little, and some of which might actually play a role. So at the end of this podcast, you should have a solid understanding of what might be worth the investment or including within your routine, and what maybe is not very useful.
Yeah, and I think you are right. Well, at least I kind of hope you're right in terms of I think there is a bit more cop on, as you said, in regard to supplements for fat loss. Like, obviously people that are just new to the industry or potentially aren't even, I will say, fitness industry adjacent, like the common average everyday person gets marketed, oh, fat loss supplements, you know? Um, but outside of that, once you're actually in this kind of health and fitness world, most people aren't pushing fat loss supplements. Like, you don't really see people going like maybe on Instagram or whatever social media, they're not really going, oh, these are the fat loss supplements you have to take. Whereas in like the 90s, the 2000s, the 20 teens, like there was, I feel, a lot more marketing towards like these are the fat loss supplements. Oh, this is the supplement I take for fat loss. Like, I feel like there was a lot more of that. Whereas nowadays, I think people are more aware of like how to modify your diet for fat loss or how to modify potentially your training for fat loss rather than kind of hoping that these supplements just magically create fat loss. I think, and I want to say that that's the case. However, it may not be. Maybe that's just the bubble that we're in. Anyway, fat loss supplements. Gary, are there actually any fat loss supplements that work? And I feel to adequately answer this question, we effectively need to do two things, right? First thing we need to do is do a little bit of a review of how fat loss actually occurs, like what's driving that, right? And then we need to basically discuss what vectors, we'll say, fat loss supplements are potentially working through. Like, what are the mechanisms or what are the potential mechanisms by which fat loss supplements, and to a degree, some of the fat loss medications. We're not going to really touch on any of the medication. Well, I say any. We're going to touch on some just because it's relevant to the conversation. But we're not really going down the medication route. We might actually do a separate podcast, now that I'm thinking of it, on just
Yeah.
like medications for fat loss, because there is some can't even fucking speak, interesting new advances in that area. But anyway, we're talking about supplements here. So Gary, how does fat loss actually occur? Like, what's the process? What's the focus? What do we as individuals need to be thinking about when we think about eliciting a fat loss adaptation? And then how do supplements fit into that equation?
Yeah, this is a really important first step because even when you're talking about drugs and medications, the first thing to try and understand is what mechanisms you're trying to target. So, for example, if you had someone who has heart failure, let's say, so basically their heart isn't functioning very well anymore, you might ask yourself, okay, how does this disease work? What are the problems associated with this disease? And what are the mechanisms by which medications might improve this disease? So, for example, it might be, all right, one of the mechanisms we want to improve is how well the heart contracts. We might want to manage blood pressure. We might want to manage some of the complications of the disease, like related to heart attacks or these types of things. So fundamentally, what we're looking at is we're trying to understand the disease itself and then seeing what mechanisms we could potentially extrapolate. And it's very similar here when it comes to fat loss, because we start with an understanding of what contributes to fat loss? Okay, it starts with a basic understanding of energy balance, or calories in, calories out. So, in its most simplest form, in order to lose body fat, we need to burn more calories or expend more calories or energy than we take in through food. So that's the fundamental summary of a whole series of complex metabolic interactions that underlie metabolism and energy balance. So that then leads us to understand, or to question, okay, how could a supplement potentially modify that equation, or that energy balance? And there's kind of three things here, or maybe a couple of more, but the main things would be, could we increase energy expenditure? How would that work? Okay, it might be that we have more energy, or more motivation for activity. It might be that it increases our body heat. So the substrates that we're using for energy are being converted to heat to a greater extent than they're being converted to ATP, or muscular energy. And therefore, these things would lead to an increase in energy expenditure. So if we can take supplements that increase the amount of calories that we burn throughout the day, then that could increase fat loss. So that's one potent mechanism there. The others would be related to how many calories we're taking in the first place. So for example, if we took supplements that would reduce the absorption of nutrients, so that we're eating these foods, but we're not actually absorbing the nutrients, then that would reduce our caloric intake, because despite the fact that they're going into our mouth, they're not going in through the lining of the gut, and therefore it doesn't really count as such towards our caloric intake. And then we could also just reduce our appetite. So are there supplements that we could take to reduce our appetite or increase our satiety, and therefore make it so that we're less likely to consume excess calories? So these are the primary mechanisms by which fat loss supplements might work. There are some other, peripheral mechanisms, like for example, could we take supplements that increase the probability of releasing fat from certain cells and not others? Like that's a bit of a reach, but these are some of the proposed mechanisms. The main ones: reducing appetite, increasing energy expenditure, or reducing the absorption of nutrients.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to just hammer that home. For fat loss to occur, we need to be paying respect to this calories in, calories out equation. And supplements fit into the equation by modifying either the calories in somehow or the calories out somehow. When we're looking at that calories in side of things, we've got a few different things that could potentially influence that. Like if you take supplements that reduce your appetite, okay, that's going to modify your calories in. If you take supplements that increase your satiety, that's going to modify the calories in. Again, you would hope that both of those things lead to you consuming less food over time, or you being able to stick to the diet more easily, right? Again, you have other supplements potentially that lead to a reduction of the absorption of those nutrients. Even though you ate the food, you don't actually get it into the body, because your digestive system, said it before, is effectively outside your body, right? It's a tube that runs through your body. And just because you've eaten food, you've put it in your mouth and swallowed it into that tube, it doesn't mean that it's actually in your body. So there's potentially supplements and medications that reduce the absorption of those nutrients that are in that tube into your actual body, right? Mainly they're kind of medications. I'm just touching on it because it does inform the conversation, right? So that's the calories inside of things, right? We can also modify the calories outside of things potentially with supplements, right? And again, we can take supplements that increase our likelihood of doing more activity, and we'll talk on like stimulants and different things in a second. But if we move more, we're going to, burn more calories throughout the day. So if we take supplements that help us move more, we're going to burn more calories, right? So that's the calories out. Now we can also take supplements potentially, or medications that increase body heat. So your like baseline metabolism. And a lot of these are to do with, we'll call it like energy wasting, even though it's not necessarily wasted. Like heat generation is a vital part of why we consume food. It's why we're able to live, like humans are able to live all around the globe. We're able to modify our body temperature. But anyway, you can take supplements that potentially increase your body heat. Now, The thing about it is a lot of the supplements that are targeted at fat loss, they usually do some combination of all of those different things. They usually do some, modification of calorie expenditure. They might do also some modification of calorie intake by reducing appetite. So basically, they're hitting a few of these different vectors, and as a result, it makes it more likely that you will lose fat because you're either able to stick to the calories in, calories out equation that leads you to be in a calorie deficit, or it increases the magnitude by which you are in a calorie deficit, right? But, and I'm really laboring the point here, the key thing is it all comes back to that calories in, calories out equation. If you take any of the drugs, supplements, whatever, that are supposed to be fat loss drugs, and you still consume more food, right? You still eat more calories than you expend, you won't lose fat. You will gain fat. If you were in a calorie surplus, you take every single fat loss supplement on the list, right? And you're still in a calorie surplus, you don't just magically lose fat, right? So there's nothing magical, nothing inherently magical, wonderful about these supplements. They just help you modify this calories in, calories out equation. And that's really important to understand because, especially if you're newer to the industry, you're newer to the marketing of fat loss supplements, etc., you can almost think that there's just some sort of magical property to these supplements, that it's like, oh, take this supplement and you're going to have magical fat loss, but that's not really the case. You take a supplement because it helps you stick to the diet, or it helps elicit, or it helps create, I should say, a bigger deficit that allows you to lose fat faster or at a more appropriate rate, whatever, right? But again, it all comes back to that calories in, calories out equation. And again, I can't labor the point enough because I know, and I know you've fallen for it, Gary. I know I've fallen for it at the start of your understanding of this stuff. You just think that these supplements have some sort of magical quality. Like, oh, that's a fat loss supplement. It just creates fat loss. And that's just not the case.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the best ways to illustrate that is to ask ourselves, but what about these guys that are taking all these, drugs, the super supplements? Even if you're looking at bodybuilders and you look at what they take from a supplementation perspective or a drugs perspective to potently increase their fat loss and get the best results and get super lean for the bodybuilding stage, all the drugs still pretty much act on these mechanisms. That's it. So, for example, some of the most common drugs that bodybuilders will use would be something like clenbuterol or other types of stimulant supplements or thyroid hormones. And both of these fundamentally work by increasing your energy expenditure and to some extent modifying appetite as well. But the main thing there really is that they're increasing energy expenditure and therefore modifying the calories in, calories out relationship. So even when you're looking at the extreme examples of bodybuilders who are willing to exploit any mechanism they can, they're still fundamentally modifying calories in, calories out at the end of the day. So we leave that aside for the moment, but the key point there is that if you want to lose body fat, you have to try to exploit these mechanisms of increasing energy expenditure, reducing caloric intake. That's it. Okay. So don't get caught up with all the other fancy stuff. That's what matters at the end of the day. And
just to kind of bounce off that, there are loads of different mechanisms. There's loads of like, oh, this is a beta adrenergic stimulant. This is an alpha adrenergic. It's going to act on these fat cells differently than this. And like that stuff, yeah, it's cool. It's important, and there's loads of different smaller nuances and mechanistic stuff that we can really dive into. And I like that stuff. I like biochemistry. I know, Gary, I know you like that stuff as well. But it's actually largely irrelevant for the conversation because the actual, like, we bring it all back. It all comes back to modifying that calories in, calories out equation, while the mechanisms by which it modifies it, yeah, that's cool to explore. What we really need to understand is we're just modifying that calories in, calories out equation. And again, I know I'm laboring the point, but I just want to make that abundantly clear because while people think that supplements have some magical qualities, they definitely think that medications have magical qualities in terms of those bodybuilders are taking X supplement and they're also taking Y drug, and it's the Y drug that's like, it just strips fat off you. It just destroys fat. It just burns it off your body. But you have to ask yourself, like, how is it doing that? Is it increasing energy expenditure? Is it decreasing energy intake? Or is it allowing them to stick to their diet better, or to stick to their training better, or to train harder, or to whatever, right? But ultimately, it's still coming back to that calories in, calories out equation. And if you really, really get that into your head, it makes you understand that, oh, I can just modify the calories in, calories out equation. I don't need to use money or to spend money to buy any of these supplements, these drugs. The supplements or drugs or whatever might modify your timeline, or they might potentially make things a little bit easier. For example, if you're on whatever stimulant, right? It might be easier to stick to your diet because your appetite is a little bit lower and you're also just burning 100 extra calories per day. So you only have to feel like you're eating, let's just say 200 less calories, but you're actually in a 300 calorie deficit and you're also not as hungry. So it's easier to stick to that. But ultimately, you could just eat in a 300 calorie deficit and change your food selection maybe so that it's more satiating, like eat a load of vegetables, for example. And you're like, okay, now it's easier to stick to my diet, you know? So again, we're thinking nutrition first. And I think I've labored that point enough. So hopefully I won't have to say it again.
Absolutely. So that takes us into some of the supplement categories that are important when it comes to fat loss. So the first one is a very broad category of stimulants. And stimulants, fundamentally what they're doing, at least a lot of the time, is acting on the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system, or adrenergic or adrenaline related signaling, is where a lot of these supplements kind of come together. There are other peripheral effects. So for example, we can have dopaminergic signaling and other modulation of neurotransmitters. But really, where these fit in is increasing the energy expenditure side of things to the greatest extent, with some effects as well on appetite regulation. So the most obvious one here would be something like caffeine. So caffeine does support fat loss, and the primary mechanism really that's important here would be increasing energy expenditure and also the modulation or the reduction of appetite or control of appetite. And the reason I say control of appetite is because there's there are mechanisms that would reduce appetite in the first place through caffeine, but there's also a very strong behavioral component here. And I think that's really important, because when people take caffeine, what do? They very often take or drink coffee or something like that. And the flavor of coffee, the liquid, etc., by consuming that, it can almost feel like a meal of sorts. So if you're having cravings, let's say, and you have a cup of coffee, okay, that's taken care of now. So there's a behavioral or a psychological element that goes alongside the mechanisms that are at play here. And there's also another thing related to that, which would be, sometimes if you're feeling a little bit low on energy, you might feel like you need to eat. And if you have a cup of coffee, now you have a bit more energy, and maybe now you're not going to eat what you were going to eat before. So there's a few different things that come together here, but all of them do center on a reduction of appetite, or I guess the management of hunger cues and everything on that side of the spectrum that might reduce your intake. And then also an increase in energy expenditure by stimulating you to move more, to have more energy, to put more effort into your workouts, etc. So that could be even something as simple as, if you didn't have your morning coffee, you might feel a bit sluggish. You might be slightly lazier. It might even just be subconscious, but you mightn't want to go and do the laundry right now, let's say. Whereas if you've had that extra cup of coffee, now you're around the house doing all the jobs. Okay, so all of that contributes to an increase in energy expenditure. And what you'll see here as well is that if you look into the research on caffeine and coffee, you'll see a lot of, mechanistic research about its effects on lipolysis, for example, which basically means it's part of the process of breaking down body fat. So if we can release more fat from the fat cells, then wouldn't that be good for fat loss? And that's part of the picture here for sure. And we see this in terms of, for example, having coffee before exercise. It can modify things like fat metabolism. But these kind of small variables of how it might release fat cells or not, or how fat gets released from fat cells or not, kind of irrelevant unless we're modifying the overall energy balance equation. So don't get lost in that stuff. The main things we're looking at here are can caffeine help you to reduce your energy intake, or can caffeine help you to increase your energy output? And for the most part, the answer to that would seem to be yes.
Yeah, and I really, again, I said I wouldn't labor it again, but I'm going to. Uh, like we can really, especially with caffeine, we can go, oh, there's this actual mechanism here for lipolysis. This is actually a really powerful like lipolytic drug. Like it's releasing fat from the fat cells. So that's obviously great for fat loss. But if you are, in a surplus, yeah, it might release some fat from the fat cells, but your body's like, well, we're just going to store these again somewhere else because we are in a surplus of energy. We don't need to use this, right? So again, it comes back to the calories in, calories out stuff, right? And I think, especially with caffeine, people don't actually realize just how potent a fat loss stimulant it is, right? Like it's a potent stimulant, first of all. Now, I know a lot of people do necessarily or do think that they go, oh, yeah, like I find I'm really stimulated if I take coffee, especially if you're not a habitual coffee drinker. Like you have a coffee, you have some people that are like, yeah, I'm wired for 3 days after that, right? Now, a lot of people have more, we'll say, normal metabolism of caffeine, and they fall in that kind of like 6 to 9 hours of stimulation from it, or some stimulation from it, right? So people are aware that it's stimulating, but I don't think a lot of people are aware that when they drink their morning coffee, they're actually taking something that is really powerful, really helpful in a fat loss context. And you really start to realize this when you look at any people that do stuff like intermittent fasting, or well, it's realistically, it should be called time restricted feeding. They'll be like, right, I eat in the later half of the day. I have my first meal at 1 o'clock, let's say, and I have my last meal at 9 p.m., whatever, right? So with them, almost every single one of them is like, oh yeah, like I have a cup of coffee in the morning. It really blunts my appetite. It really, allows me to stay feeling fuller for longer and allows me to push off that first meal until the middle of the day, you know? And you really start to realize you're like, fuck, actually, this is a really powerful appetite suppressant. It's also a really powerful energy mobilizer, we'll say, because again, it's releasing that fat from the fat cells, which means it's ready for use. You really start to realize that this is actually really potent for fat loss, and people are still just like, oh yeah, I'll just drink my morning coffee and I'm going to take other stimulants, I'm going to take other things for fat loss. So if you're and the reason I'm saying this is because you need to kind of take the totality of your diet into account. Like you're probably burning an extra, let's just put it at a figure of 100 extra calories per day because of your 2 cups of coffee, right? We'll just put it at that, right? It's like, oh, you're eating or you're burning an extra 100 calories because you're fidgeting a bit more because of caffeine, etc. And maybe you have 100 calories of hunger blunting from caffeine as well, we'll just say, right? So you're basically giving an extra 200 calories just because you drink 2 cups of coffee a day, or even a cup of coffee per day, right? That's obviously really helpful on a fat loss diet. Like surprisingly helpful. 200 calories is actually quite a lot, right? And again, the reason I'm saying this is because people will be hammering their 2 coffees a day, and then they're like, well, what other fat loss supplements can I take? What other stimulants can I take? When you're already on one of the most beneficial, one of the most powerful ones that we have legally available to us.
Yeah, and this, to be fair, one of the difficult things about it is that the less you consume it, the more potent it's going to be, which is a bit of a paradox, because if you want to maximize your fat loss, you're like, oh, well, I'll take more of it. But unfortunately, one of the things you do observe is that even when it comes to things like the increase in heart rate or increase in blood pressure in response to caffeine, the more you consume it, the more that effect is blunted. So, for example, the first time you have a cup of coffee, if you're quite sensitive to it, you might see your resting heart rate go from 50 to 60, 65 plus. I've just had 2 coffees there this morning, and my resting heart rate at the moment is 47, and I'm on a podcast talking, so I'm probably up a little bit already. So for me, caffeine literally does not change my resting heart rate. Maybe a couple of beats, but pretty much nothing. Whereas if you're someone that's really sensitive and you're getting 10 to 15 extra beats, like that adds up. Those beats of your heart don't occur in the absence of energy. They require energy, and they're reflective of your overall metabolic state, you could say. So yeah, if you're the person that's really jittery after caffeine, you're super hyper and you feel super energetic, well, you're burning more extra calories in response to that. I still find that I get the appetite blunting or the hunger management, we'll say, benefits of caffeine. I don't find them to be modified as such by how habituated I am. And I think a lot of that is to do with the behavioral or psychological components that I've mentioned. So, for example, when I got up this morning, I had my coffee and I didn't have breakfast. And, I'm going to be training after this at 10:30 or 11, which will take me to 1 or 2 o'clock by the time I'm home. So I'll be having my first meal then. And it was the coffee or the caffeine that really, carried me over during the morning. So I think that those behavioral or psychological elements can't be, understated there. It's really important. So can't be understated, can't be overstated.
Either way.
Can't be. Yeah, we'll go with that anyway. Um, but yeah, that's caffeine pretty much. I don't think there's too much else to be said on that. There are other caffeine adjacent kind of ingredients that you'll see. Sometimes, you'll see various caffeine salts, caffeine dimalates, different types of caffeine that are marketed to be of a different bioavailability or release speed, etc. Just have caffeine in its normal form, caffeine anhydrous if you're supplementing, or caffeine through coffee, etc. Doesn't matter. Don't worry about that. A lot of them are just kind of marketing, trying to make them sound special. So yeah, that's caffeine.
A lot of them they're like, oh, there's no drop off in energy because of this. They're like, we have this special form, so you don't get a, what do they call it? A crash, right? They're like, oh,
Yeah.
you don't get a crash of energy. The reason most of them work is because they actually just drip feed the caffeine out for longer. So
Yeah.
you just have the caffeine in your system for longer. So there's no crash because you're still taking the drug effectively.
Yeah.
um, Again, that might be what you want. If you've an all day event, you're like, I just want to be on point. Cool. But maybe that's not the best if you're taking your caffeine later in the day and you're still up at 4 a.m. the next morning. But anyway, caffeine is obviously one of the goats when it comes to fat loss supplements. But there are other ones, Gary. What are some of the other ones?
Yeah, so some of these are very much related. For example, green tea is another one that's marketed heavily when it comes to fat loss. I remember early on in my fitness days, as soon as I'd be trying to lose fat, I'd be slamming green tea. I'd be having it with different meals and stuff. It's actually all right. I liked it at the time. I haven't had green tea in a while now, but yeah, not bad. And caffeine is obviously very much related to this, but there are other ingredients in green tea that might lend themselves to improving fat loss. But I wouldn't say I'm that hyped about them really. I think, if you like green tea, fire away, be my guest. Just drink it like you would your coffee. But I wouldn't be particularly enthusiastic about, supplementing with green tea extracts and these types of things. I don't think there's much there in terms of wins that you couldn't be getting by just having your caffeine or coffee. So I'm not sure about you, but green tea, not a regular recommendation, I would say.
No, and again, it's basically coming back to that calories in, calories out equation. It's doing the exact same thing as coffee, maybe to a lesser extent. It's blunting appetite, or it's stimulating you a bit more so you move more. Now, there are mechanistic things. You'd be like, oh, well, it actually does this particular thing to this particular pathway that might be relevant for fat loss, like maybe it interacts with the, AMPK kinase pathway. But again, that mechanistic stuff, while it's cool, really enjoyable, great science, etc., it's not actually the stuff that's working. The stuff that's working is, are we modifying calories in, calories out? So if you take green tea, it makes you a little bit more energetic, you move more, or it makes you stick to your diet a little bit better, or potentially make you hyper stick to your diet, i.e., you eat even less than you intended to, then obviously that's going to help with fat loss, right? But there's no magical, this property, right? Which kind of brings us to the next one, which definitely, well, I actually think it's illegal right now in most countries in the Western world. I know you can get it in some countries, even in Europe, but it's ephedrine, right? This was, Gary, when we were coming up, This was the
Yeah.
supplement. This was the fat loss supplement. You have the ephedrine, caffeine, and potentially also aspirin stack. So the ECA stack, right? That fat loss so easy, right? But while there is mechanisms by which this potentially is a beneficial supplement that is actually synergistic with caffeine, ultimately, again, it just comes back to the same things. It's like, all right, this is a stimulant that makes you less hungry, makes your appetite lower, and also makes you move more. It also makes you just expend more energy, even though you're in a deficit, where other people, if they weren't on a supplement like this in a deficit, they would spontaneously move less, right? So there's no inherent like, oh, this is a magical interaction with this pathway. It does some cool things, don't get me wrong. Again, it's that beta adrenergic stimulant, it's a bronchodilator, it does a whole host of different things, which again, potentially beneficial for fat loss at a mechanistic level. But you could take that and not lose fat if you didn't respect the calories in, calories out equation, right? So while it's cool, and there are I think legal alternatives, we'll say, such as synephrine. Like there's different like either related compounds or somewhat metabolites of ephedrine, and they're still available in various forms. But again, it's just coming back to that same thing. They just keep you feeling fuller for a little bit longer, and they make you move more. There's no magical quality to them. There might be some magical quality to, well, I say magical, it's not actually magical, but some like extra quality to the next one that we're going to talk about. But Gary, do you have anything to say about ephedrine or synephrine or any of
No,
those related?
no.
Again, it's just a stimulant. It's not doing anything magical. Now, the next one we want to talk about is yohimbine. Now, there's a few, again, different metabolites and different things that potentially could be substituted in for this. Like there's one called Rawalcine or something like that, which seems to be a little bit more potent with less side effects. But again, we won't get into all of the different subcategories of it, I suppose. But yohimbine, right? Again, it's a stimulant, does all the same thing that caffeine does all the same stuff in terms of modifying our calories in. It makes you feel a little bit or a little bit less hungry. It makes you move a little bit more. It also makes you just like, sweat a little bit more, produce heat, loss to the environment, etc. Right? So same stuff that caffeine is doing, green tea is doing, ephedrine is doing. However, with yohimbine, it does work on, we'll say, the alpha adrenergic pathway. Now, this is again very mechanistic stuff, and I've been saying, and we've been reiterating the point that the mechanistic stuff is largely actually irrelevant to the conversation because the fat loss is occurring by virtue of the calories in, calories out equation, right? But people really like yohimbine, even though in some people actually does cause like anxiety and like psychological issues. Like it's actually really interesting because you'll often see in neuroscience papers, they'll use yohimbine as a kind of a reference drug for a variety of different things because it actually does a lot to neurons, brain cells, different areas of the brain, etc. Right? But because it works on that alpha adrenergic pathway, it's actually stimulating fat loss in certain areas of the body that might be harder to lose fat on. And this is especially more relevant to, say, bodybuilders who are looking to really lose the last like 1 to 2% of body fat. They're like, my lower abs, they don't seem to be losing fat as much as I want to kind of just prioritize that. And while we often talk about, oh, you can't spot reduce fat, like you can to some extent influence that. Certain parts of the body have more of an expression of this like beta receptor, we'll just say, we'll put it like that. Whereas other parts of the body have more of an expression of this alpha receptor. Again, simplifying it just to make it more easily understandable, but that's how we'll play it, right? And we don't really stimulate this alpha receptor. Again, this is not the actual way. I'm oversimplifying it. It's kind of making me angry, but we're going to simplify because it makes it easier. So we don't generally stimulate this alpha receptor when we're just doing our normal stuff, when we're dieting, etc. So you have areas of the body that don't lose fat as easily. Now you will still lose fat from those areas, and as long as you stay in a deficit for long enough, you will eventually mobilize the fat from those areas, right? However, we can somewhat prioritize those areas by taking something like yohimbine, right? However, this really only applies to people that are trying to lose that very last little bit. Like if you are 20 kilos overweight and you take yohimbine, it's not going to just prioritize, lower ab fat. Yeah, you might get a little bit extra stimulation there, but it's actually going to be unnoticeable, not noticeable in the slightest. And you've just exposed yourself to a supplement that potentially gives you anxiety, gives you all these other side effects where you just didn't need it, right? So while there is some, again, I'm calling it a magical quality in terms of it might help you target certain areas of the body, it really only matters for someone that's a bodybuilder looking to get like stage lean. You might be like, oh, well, I have just the last little bit of fat on my glutes. Maybe some yohimbine might help, right? What are your thoughts there, Gary?
Yeah, I think again, I think if you're a bodybuilder and you're trying to get extremely lean, more than 99.9% of the population, then pulling on these levers makes sense. For anyone else, it's pretty much a waste of your time. You definitely want to be single digit body fat before you're going to be worrying about this, because fundamentally what we're trying to do when someone is extremely lean is to maximize fat loss while also maximizing muscle retention. So anything that we can do to liberate more fat cells, or more fat from the fat cells that we're trying to get rid of, or shrink, I should say, is going to be in our favor. So even if this was a 1% greater increase in fat liberation from lower abdominal body fat, that's actually worth it when you're already 5 or 6% body fat and you're talking about very minute changes. However, this is going to be entirely unnoticeable for the vast majority of people, even me at the moment, right? Like I have slightly visible abs, but I don't have veins on my abs. I'm not absolutely shredded. This would make no difference for me. It might make some difference to maybe appetite management or stimulants, as per this broader discussion, but from a spot reduction perspective, very unlikely to have any meaningful effect, and not something I take for that reason.
Yeah, 100%. What other stimulants, Gary? What else in this?
So the final one is clenbuterol, and this kind of falls into a broader category. Clenbuterol is actually similar to the blue inhaler that a lot of you take, which is salbutamol. If you're an asthmatic, there's also albuterol and various other alls or orals, salmeterol, etc., that fit into this drug category. And these act again on various adrenergic receptors, the primary one here being beta 2. So they're beta 2 agonists. So the big effect that they're going to have here is acting on, the lungs from a pharmacology perspective, as in, like, why would these be used in medicine? Largely because they're bronchodilators. So if you're asthmatic, you have bronchoconstriction, and if you dilate that, it opens up your airways, and now you're able to breathe clearer. But as many asthmatics will know, if they take a very high dose of their inhaler, they might find themselves getting, tachycardic. So their heart rate is increasing. They might feel their heart racing, generally feel a bit more hypermetabolic. And that's exactly what happens here with something like clenbuterol. So you end up with an effect where you're being stimulated. There are some effects on the level of the muscle as well, which is interesting. So if you have you do have adrenergic receptors on your muscles as well, and this could potentially have an effect on performance. You might say that is separate to fat loss itself. But overall, the main effect here with something like clenbuterol and other beta adrenergic agonists would be to increase energy expenditure. And this is why when bodybuilders take clenbuterol, what they'll often report is that they're wide awake at night, they're wired, they're sweating all the time, they're jittery, and that's generally a hypermetabolic state. People will also get anxiety, similar to what you said about yohimbine, and that's the case for all these stimulants. When you take a lot of stimulants, you get more anxious, because that's a reflection of this kind of hypermetabolic, hyperstimulated state. On the On the basic physical level that you can observe, it might be physical jitteriness and sweating. But on the psychological level, then that's your mind racing, racing through all your thoughts. So all of these fit into this one category of stimulants that are going to lead to a hyperstimulated state, a hypermetabolic state that can increase energy expenditure with also peripheral effects then. And I shouldn't say peripheral because I don't mean peripheral in terms of the nervous system. I just mean related side effects that might also manage your appetite. So that's stimulants really.
Yeah, so that's the broader class of stimulants. There are other ones. There are loads of different avenues that we could go down with this, but I think people get the idea. Stimulants are basically all working by making your appetite go down. So you're just less hungry. So you're able to either stick to your diet or you're able to just induce a deficit by virtue of not eating, right? They also work by increasing your energy expenditure because you either move more because you have a little bit more energy, you're not as, you don't feel as tired, or they make you do stuff like you're more jittery, you're like on edge, you're like just moving around, buzzing basically, right? So they're modifying the calories in, calories out equation. Cool. That's stimulants. What next, Gary?
Yeah, next is body heat, you could say. Something very mild here could be something like capsaicin, for example. You'll see that in some supplements. Probably has some effect, can have effects on your appetite, can have effects on increasing your body temperature. But the real kind of heavy hitter here would be something like dinitrophenol, which is DNP. And DNP is a drug that is still actually used by bodybuilders. I know bodybuilders who take DNP and the interesting reports, but the mechanism here is actually quite interesting, and it relates to something that's referred to as uncoupling. So normally in your muscles or in your cells generally, when you're creating energy or you're converting energy substrates to ATP, what you'll have in a very efficient metabolic state is that you're taking let's say that your carbohydrate molecule has 12 AT, or the carbohydrate intake has 30 ATP that you could get out. Okay, let's just keep it as a whole number. If that's 30 ATP worth of carbohydrate and you get 30 ATP out, that system is 100% efficient. If you have if you have 30 ATP worth of carbohydrate and that only gives you 15 ATP out the other end, then there's 15 ATP worth of energy that has been wasted somehow. And this is entirely normal in metabolism. It's not 100% efficient system.
And just on that, you don't want it to be 100%.
No, you don't want that at all.
You don't want it to be 100% efficient. You want to have, like, if you were 100% efficient, just think about this logically. If you're 100% efficient, your body would be ice cold, right?
Yep, ice
because
cold.
you would have no extra heat loss. You have no heat loss to the environment, right? So we do want some. That allows us to keep our body temperature at that kind of, whatever it is. What's body temperature? I want to say 35 degrees, 37, whatever.
Yeah, 36.5, 37.5.
So it allows us to keep our body temperature there. Now, what's really interesting about this is there actually are potentially differences in terms of ethnicities. Like if you come from a population or a peoples, I should say, that we're always around the equator, right? You potentially have a more efficient, more efficient system because you haven't had to generate as much body heat. Like you have evolved, your systems have evolved in an area where it's just always warm, right? Whereas if you have always been from, like, I don't know, as far north as possible, that's where your people evolved, etc. I shouldn't say they didn't evolve there, but you know what I mean when I'm saying that, like the colloquial understanding of evolved, right? That's where they've been. You potentially have a less efficient system because you want to produce more body heat. You want to lose more body heat to the surrounding area because it keeps you warmer, right? So that's just an interesting aside. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, and that is an important point because, like, basically what we're talking here is that there's a natural loss of efficiency within the system or a natural inefficiency. And it's this efficiency or energy leak that enables us to maintain our body heat. Okay. We are endotherms. We don't just, depend on the environment for our heat. We also create our own. And that is a result of inefficiency within metabolic systems. So let's say normally, and just to keep the whole numbers, you take in 30 ATP worth of energy substrate and you get 20 out in a state of health, let's say. Okay. 10 ATP worth is contributing to things like the maintenance of your body heat. And then you take a drug that reduces that so that you're only getting 10 ATP worth of ATP. You're only getting 10 ATP out of 30 ATP worth of carbohydrate. Now you've got this extra loss of energy that's being lost, and therefore your overall metabolic rate would be increasing. So your caloric expenditure is increasing, meaning that you'd be able to eat more calories, but because the ATP itself, which is what's going to be leading to something like body fat gain, because that's not coming out the other side, now you're in a position where you're going to have, let's say, a 20 or 33% increase in your metabolic rate as a result of that. And the way that this works is through something called uncoupling. So if you have a perfectly...
But the way I always think it, because again, I'm an idiot, and it really helps me visualize these things in metaphors, right? Like the way this, like your mitochondria is working. So all that was Gary was saying there was you basically eat food. And if we think about this like a water, like a hydropower plant, right? Basically you eat food, that's putting water into the tank up top, right? And what you're doing with that water is using it to drive a turbine. This actually ATPase, right? It's like a kind of a pump, right? So that's what they do. They'll put a dam on a gorge or whatever, let a load of water fill up behind it. And then when they want to produce energy, they'll open up the turbines and the water coming through spins the turbines. You get energy out the other side, right? So that's basically the same way that your mitochondria are working. You eat food, it goes through the electron transport chain, and you're basically putting these hydrogens in the tank, right? You're filling up the tank. And then what those hydrogens are doing down the line is they're going through this ATPase and they're being used to create ATP, right? They're being used to power this pump, right? We'll think of it like that. Now, it's not perfectly like that, but that's how we'll think of it, right? Now, there is some loss of those hydrogens up top, right? You've pumped them up, they're in the dam, there's some leakage. There's some, it goes off this little side stream over here and, it doesn't get used for energy production, right? Now, what can happen in such stuff like Gary's about to explain here with proton uncoupling, you can basically get those side streams to take more effectively. So Gary, go on. I'm going to come back to this analogy here in a second, but I'm just setting it up.
Yeah, that's basically it. So fundamentally what you need is you actually need a gradient. So you need a proton or hydrogen gradient for the ATPase, which is what creates ATP from these energy substrates right at the end of the metabolic pathways. You need a gradient that's there. So what ends up happening is fundamentally we get these uncoupling proteins which lead to greater uncoupling. So we get more leakage of these hydrogen ions, and therefore fundamentally we get an increase in heat generation that's occurring, making the system less efficient. So if you're thinking about perfect efficiency, as we said, you eat carbohydrates, you eat fats, etc., and you get the perfect 30 ATP out the other end. If it's normally 20 ATP that you're actually getting out the other end because of the natural inefficiencies, and you take something like this drug which increases the uncoupling, you might now only get 10 ATP out the other side. And that's because you're losing more of these hydrogens. You're creating less energy as a result. You're making a more inefficient metabolic system. And therefore, if you wanted to satisfy your energy needs, for example, let's say this is totally wrong, but if you needed 2000 ATP worth of energy per day, you now need to consume 33% more calories throughout the day to actually supply that ATP. So fundamentally, what we're talking about is making the system less efficient so that we create more heat, waste more energy, and therefore burn more calories.
Yeah. So again, going back to that analogy, you now have a system that you eat food, you pump up all these hydrogens, and you're like, okay, cool. The tank is full. I've put in enough to make the tank full, right? And then you turn on the tap or you turn on the turbines, and then you go, hold on a second. We're only 80% of the way where we should be. I thought we had a full tank, but the tank's only at 80%. What happened there? Effectively, we've diverted some of that water in the tank up the top, behind the dam, whatever way you want to think of it. We've diverted it somewhere else. There's water loss. There's a leakage somewhere that's being put out elsewhere, right? And that's what stuff like DMP does. Now, you might go, fuck, actually, this sounds phenomenal. This is clearly the best way forward. I basically just have an inefficient energy production system that allows me to eat the same amount of food and still lose weight, right? And we've talked about it before, or we just mentioned it before. You lose heat to the environment, right? That's what this proton leakage does. It's not all it does, and it's not perfectly analogous here, but you lose heat to the environment. Gary, is there a potential problem with losing some of this water in the tank if that water loss also generates heat?
Yeah, it's definitely not good. Do not want. Okay, so this can kill you. You know, if you're basically, you're technically, in a way, you're setting yourself on fire. You know, like that's basically what you're doing. If you let this go totally uncontrolled and you create a ton of heat, your body's going to overheat and you're going to die. Okay, so that actually literally does happen, and like the problem is, and well, it's a good thing, but our body is designed in such a way that we require very small margins. So for your enzymes to work appropriately, they need to be kept within a certain temperature range. They need a certain pH, etc. And if our pH increases too much or decreases too much, temperature increases too much, decreases too much, these enzymes no longer work. Your cells can't work properly, and then we run into various problems such as death at the extreme. And this can occur here if you take too much DNP and you let uncoupling just go crazy. Then suddenly we need to or suddenly we're getting all of this heat production as a result of these metabolic events, and that is really not good. So you end up being hyperthermic, and as a result, you can actually die from that. So don't necessarily recommend that. The other thing that's important here, I suppose, that goes back to what Pat.
Like, there's no way to stop this once it's happened. And
Yeah.
we don't have something that's a proton coupler. We don't have a way to keep these in once it's in the system. And you might go, oh, well, I'll just put you in like an ice bath or something so that, your body temperature goes down. But that's like saying like, oh, I'm just going to shove a load of ice in my oven while it's on and hopefully that'll cool it down. Like, yeah, it's going to cool it down, or it's going to require a longer cooking time because, it doesn't get up to the heat temperature that it could get up to, but it's not turning your oven off. So you could die from this. We do not recommend.
Yeah, so don't try this at home, kids. And the other thing is that, these uncoupling proteins that we're talking about that exist within the mitochondrial membrane, they are also modified by other stressors. I talked about this in an email a few weeks ago for those on the newsletter. If you're not on the newsletter, make sure you're subscribed. But I talked a bit about cold stress, for example. So Patty was talking about people in different environments, and if you were exposed to prolonged cold exposure, you get an increase in what's referred to as brown adipose tissue. So brown adipose tissue naturally has more of these uncoupling proteins. And therefore, if you have high brown adipose tissue activity, which occurs in response to cold exposure, you actually get more uncoupling because you need more heat generation that's taking place. Now, as discussed in that email, it's probably not enough of an effect from you doing your 15 minutes of an ice bath in the morning. It's probably not, that significant. But, if you were out in the cold all the time and you worked in a freezing cold environment, you would actually have this increase in brown adipose tissue that is increasing your metabolic rate to some extent, but its primary purpose there is to increase body heat generation. So fundamentally, these are endogenous normal physiological systems, normal efficiencies or inefficiencies that are built into the system. And when we take DNP or a drug like it, we're trying to exploit that. But of course, as a result, there can be very significant risks. This happened, I think, in the 1930s initially, I believe, when DNP was used as kind of a weight loss drug. It was thought that, oh, this seems like a great idea. People died. So just if you can just get into a calorie deficit without using this, that'd be fantastic.
I'm pretty sure DNP was a byproduct of the TNT industry.
Yes.
And they basically noticed that the people that were handling this stuff were just losing weight like crazy. And then they sold it from these like mail order magazines. They just order it effectively online. They didn't have the internet, but it was just wild, just fucking taking these things. But anyway, it is also interesting when you say with the like brown adipose tissue, like we have brown adipose tissue, well, especially babies and different things have brown adipose tissue. You can get it from cold exposure, but the reason it's brown is just because you have more mitochondria in
Yeah.
that tissue. There are other tissues like fat tissues, like beige adipose tissue, so it has
Mhm.
some mitochondria in it, whereas brown adipose tissue has a lot of mitochondria. We could just do something like aerobic exercise and get more, first of all, calorie burning there and then from doing the aerobic exercise, and an increase in mitochondria in like your muscle cells, etc., and get more fat loss as a result of that, rather than like thinking, oh, my 3 minute ice bath is what's going to really influence me to get some brown adipose or browning of my adipose tissue, and hopefully that's going to result in some extra fat loss. You just get more mitochondria by doing some aerobic exercise. Excuse me. You get some more mitochondria by just doing more aerobic exercise, and as a result of that, you you get basically the exact same effects. Now, it's not the exact analogous stuff, but I would argue that there's far more benefits to being aerobically fit than cold adapted.
Yeah, definitely pro exercise. Get on it.
So anyway, Gary, the last one. There are other things that we're not going to touch on in this episode, but the last one, because I wanted to bring in something that influences the calories in side of things a bit more, is like appetite suppressants. Now, the thing is, most of these stimulants, not necessarily DNP, although some people get really high anxiety and different things from it, and they also generate a lot of body heat, so they don't necessarily want to eat because there's a thermic effect of feeding as well, so you get even warmer and you're like, oh, I'm just done. But appetite suppressants, what's the story there, Gary?
Yeah, there are actually a lot of things that fit into this category, and I think what we'll do is discuss maybe some of the centrally acting and hormonal slash gut peptide components of this in the drugs episode. But the real one where we end up leveraging this is probably fiber or fiber related compounds. So, for example, if you're supplementing with fiber, like we know that that does help with appetite management. There's also, probably some loss of calories to some extent as a result of an increase in fiber that can happen. That can obviously be exacerbated if you're taking very, very, very high fiber doses and have explosive diarrhea, but we don't necessarily recommend that. So fiber in general is something that, like, you want to be getting enough through your diet, but then if not, then you can also supplement with fiber or various supplemental forms of fiber to reduce your energy intake. So that's something that definitely has a role. Along with that, on the dietary side would be something like protein. So having enough protein in the diet, or supplementing if you don't have enough through your food, is also going to help with appetite management. So we know that people are generally more satiated when they have a higher protein intake and also when they have a high fiber intake. So they're kind of the big levers really when it comes to appetite management. As I said, there are various other drugs slash supplements that fit into this category, especially those that relate to like dampening down appetite centrally within the brain, etc. And that's what we'll discuss in the medical episode.
Yeah, and on the appetite stuff, some of these appetite suppressants, we'll call them, again, stimulants generally have an appetite suppressing effect for most people at least. But some of these appetite suppressants, basically, they're not really appetite suppressants, they're more satiety increasing agents, right? So you take some fiber in, like you feel fuller for longer. For example, if you're really struggling to stick to your calories and you're just like, these meals aren't satisfying me, one of the things you can do is just eat more vegetables at those meals. Now, the reason that works is because you eat more fiber. These vegetables are usually higher volume, low calorie foods. Like you eat a lot of broccoli, it's like you get 5 calories, and it's like, I've just eaten 200 grams of broccoli. That's not the equivalent, but you get the idea, right? So you eat foods that keep you feeling fuller for longer, but you can also supplement to get this effect. You can also take something like psyllium husk, right? You're like, oh, these meals are not satiating enough. You could effectively just bring in a shake, right? You get some psyllium husk, shake it up in a shake with water and drink that. And all of a sudden you're like, wow, I actually feel fuller for longer, right? And there's a variety of reasons why that happens. Fiber reduces transit time, reduces digestion speed, we should say, increases transit time, and effectively just serves to keep you fuller for longer. It effectively serves to keep you with a more, we'll say, even drip of nutrients into the bloodstream, so you're not getting these high swings, ups and downs, which can all serve to keep you feeling fuller for longer. And as a result of that, you either eat less calories as a result, or you're able to stick to the diet that you're supposed to be eating and not feel like, oh, I need to snack or I need to eat more here and there. Now, protein also does that to an extent. And again, this is why you'll see people saying, look, if you're on a fat loss diet, you really need to prioritize your protein at each of your meals. Don't just be like, oh, I need to hit whatever, 150 grams of protein. I'll eat that all at dinner. Like, you want to spread that out throughout the day, first of all, from a muscle building, muscle retention perspective, but also that's going to keep you satiated. That's going to keep you feeling fuller for longer. And as a result, stick to your diet a lot easier, right? However, there are also components to both of these, like you mentioned, Gary, where they do actually potentially serve to bind to other nutrients in the system, and you actually get a bit of a lowering of nutrients actually getting into the body, right? For example, fiber might bind to other nutrients, whatever you've eaten, some protein, some carbs, some fats, whatever. It'll definitely bind to some fats via like bile acid sequestration or whatever. But you then don't consume the calories. Like, you've consumed them physically, I've eaten them, but you actually don't get them into the body, and you basically poop them out without digesting them. Protein also does this to an extent, not necessarily just protein in its normal form, but if you ever eat stuff like charred, beef or whatever, that kind of Maillard reaction that happens that makes it really tasty on the outside, that polycyclic amines, like, they effectively do bind to things in your gut and you don't digest them. Now, you might break down the protein peptide bonds and whatever else, but it's still potentially lowering the absorption of nutrients from the food that you've eaten, right? Protein itself also has a higher thermic effect of feeding, in that to break down, to digest, to assimilate, to use that protein, you actually burn a few extra calories, right? And this is something that's quite interesting when you really first learn about it. And then obviously it makes sense, where you're like, okay, so protein has a bit of a higher thermic effect of feeding. So I could stay at 2,000 calories. Let's say I have 2,000 calories and I have 10% of that is protein, right? If I eat those 2,000 calories with 10% of protein, let's say I use 50 calories to digest that protein. If I then just kept that same 2,000 calorie intake and increased my protein intake to, let's say, 30% or 40%, right? I might actually induce more of a deficit, even though I'm still eating the same calories, because there's a higher thermic effect of feeding, meaning your body burns more energy to break down that protein. So you could end up in 100 calories, maybe 150 calorie deficit, just by virtue of eating more protein, right? So again, it comes back to that calories in, calories out equation, but that it can be a little bit confusing when you really parse out all the nuances of it, because we often just think, oh, I eat food, that's the calories in. When in reality, we have to account for all the downstream things, where it's like, okay, you ate the food, but did it actually get into your system? Or did you eat it with a load of fiber, a load of other things that reduce the digestion of this food and you basically pooped it out? Or did your body have to work extra hard? Did it actually have to use a load of energy to really break down, assimilate, and use those nutrients, i.e. something like protein, for example? You might need to do that. And as a result, you're actually modifying the calories in, calories out equation, right? But anyway, that's all I really have for the supplement side of things. Unless you want to say anything else, Gary, wrap it up.
No, that covers us for this week. So, as always, guys, if you'd like to work with us and get to the essence of what's really important when it comes to your nutrition, training, etc., we do have coaching spaces available. You can put in your details in the description box below, at the link below, and we will be back to you with more information about the coaching process. We also put out a lot of free information on our social media at Triage Method, also at our website, www.triagemethod.com, and of course, via our newsletter. So the Triage Method newsletter, you can subscribe to that below as well and get weekly emails with exclusive content that you won't see on our social media. Of course, if you like the podcast, we always appreciate when people share it, when they leave a rating and review, recommend it to friends, etc. And we do finally have a nutrition certification that you can partake in if you want to learn more about, fat loss, and most importantly, how to coach all of this, how to get results with clients, get more clients, get results, and get a great nutrition coaching business. Then you can join the Triage Method Nutrition Certification.
100%. And we should say we have a payment plan available, because I know a lot of people
Yes.
did ask about that. They were like, oh, I don't have the money up front. We do now have a payment plan available in place. So you can pay over 6 months, right? So go check it out. If that's something that appeals to you, sign up.
Absolutely. And we'll see you next week, guys. Thank you very much.